you for joining the Business Operations Educational Conference as part of the 2021 Virtual Southeast Regional Fruit and Vegetable Conference. I'm Blake Brown, an extension economist at North Carolina State University, where I direct the Executive Farm Management Program. I will be the moderator for this presentation. Our presentation will be live, and we will be answering questions live at the end of the presentation. You can submit your question at any point during this presentation by typing your question into the questions box and pressing send. Don't forget to thank our 2021 sponsors, and you can also visit the virtual trade show and the featured products pavilion. Lastly, don't forget to join us each morning for coffee chats and each evening for networking. Check the conference agenda for details. Now I'd like to introduce Scott Mickey with Clemson University, who will be presenting, Do You Feel Confident in Your Financials? Scott is an extension associate with Clemson Extension Agribusiness Team. He provides financial direction to farms and other ag businesses. He specializes in risk management, financial performance analysis, monitoring financial plans, and marketing plans. Scott coordinates both the Southeast Agricultural Lender School and the Executive Marketing Seminar. Scott also leads the financial education in the Executive Farm Management Program, a multi-state business management program for farmers. Well, folks, financial management is more important than ever in 2021. Scott is going to give you some key financial ratios and metrics to help guide you in managing your farm this year. I know you're going to gain a lot from his presentation. Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Blake, and thank you all for joining us today at the Southeast Fruit and Vegetable Conference, and talking with you about how confident do you feel with your financials. And what we're going to do is just talk about a few key numbers and some high-level financial information, just to give you a teaser for some ideas that you might want to implement in managing your operation. I wouldn't start a presentation without addressing this slide right here. As we move into 2021, I think we have to evaluate your risk position. Looking back at 2020, we certainly faced risk in all 5 of these areas. In the people area, I know some of you may have had trouble getting your H-2A workers when you needed them. Weather has always caused havoc with production. On the legal side, the lots of government program opportunities this year that were new for many of us, provided some assistance when we really needed it. In the market, there were certainly changes. I'm sure some of you had markets change drastically during the year just because of the pandemic. All of these different things had a big impact on our financial situation. In some areas, we may feel more vulnerable. Some areas, we may feel resilient. And hopefully after today, you'll have some ideas on how to become more agile in the financial management and managing the risk in your operation. The big thing we want to take away from risk management, though, is focus on managing what you can control and figure out ways to manage around those risks that are uncontrollable. And with that, let's go ahead and dive into some information. We'll start off with my friend Floyd. Floyd is kind of my manager of those controllable actions within my operation. And so let me tell you a little bit more about Floyd. Floyd stands for Family Living and Income Taxes. Every business hopefully has to pay some income taxes and needs some return to family living, whether it's a draw or from some other fashion. The next part of Floyd is operating expenses. Every business has those operating expenses that have to be covered, and Floyd helps manage that concept. We also have to pay interest if we've borrowed any money to the bank, and then we also have debt repayment, the principal portion of debt that needs to be repaid. So to summarize what Floyd is, he really represents the break-even revenue that a business needs to be successful. Because if we generate enough revenue to take care of Floyd, we want to find that the family's happy because they've got what they needed. Our vendors are happy because they've been paid for all the expenses that we incurred, and our banker's happy. You know, the interest has been paid and the debt. So getting to the level of Floyd is a pretty good thing. So for example, if the business had family living and income tax obligations of $100,000 and $600,000 for operating expenses and $70,000 in interest on their operating loans and also their term debt, and had to repay $130,000 of principal, that operation would need to have $900,000 of revenue in order to break even. Now, is that a good spot to be? Well, if you're like most producers I know, it's probably not. Because we'd like to do a little bit better than just break even. So what if the revenue turned out to be $1 million? Well, that operation would still have the same family living and income tax expenses, same operating expenses, and the same interest and principal obligations. But that extra $100,000 would go towards asset growth. It would be an opportunity to increase the earned equity of the business by $100,000. As long as we manage Floyd, this extra $100,000 is what I call getting the duck, okay? And that's really what we're trying to do in the business, is not only take care of Floyd, but also to gather up some ducks and increase the assets and the equity within our business. So let's look at it a little more formal way, although it's probably not, if there's an accountant in the group, it's probably not formal enough for them. But let's talk about how this earnings actually gets used in the business. Let's just keep this simple. We'll start off and say the business has $100 of revenue. And that revenue would be from things like crop sales, livestock sales, you know, your primary enterprise income or revenue. And it would also include things like custom work, government payments, patronage refunds, and other things. It's all of the revenue that's coming into the business. With that revenue, we'd have to pay our operating expenses. And those are direct expenses such as your pesticide, fertilizer, labor, as well as overhead items like utilities and property taxes, all of those types of things. It's all the expenses the business would incur except for interest and depreciation. Now, granted, if you only spent $60 of the 100 on operating expenses, your business would be very efficient. That's a very, very high operating efficiency at 60%. But nevertheless, that would leave us with $40 of earnings, or as I call it, EBITDA, which stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And this is what I really like about this chart. When you have $40 of earnings, there's only 4 places the business can spend that money. Okay? First one would be for family living or income taxes. And ideally, we would spend 25% of our earnings or less on family living and income tax. The next is we would want to spend no more than 50% on the combination of interest and debt repayment. I'm showing 10 in each category, but we want to keep our debt repayment less than 50% of our earnings if we can on a year in, year out basis. And so if we spend $30 of our earnings on family living interest and debt, that leaves us 10 for equity growth or for asset growth. And this would be a really ideal situation because we've got our vendors happy, the family's happy, our bank's happy, and we've also grown the business by 10% of our revenue or 25% of our earnings have gone to growth. A business that can do this is going to be able to grow at a relatively low risk pace, but this would be ideal situation. But often we have a year like this one, and instead of $100 of revenue, we have $80. And generally, our operating expenses don't go down significantly when we have these revenue drops. So we may still have $60 of operating expenses, and now our earnings are only $20. But we still only have those 4 places that we can spend our earnings. I don't like to talk about other people's families, so I'm going to talk about my family. In my family, they would still be expecting that $10 for family living during the year. Okay, just because the farm had a drop in revenue, the family probably isn't looking to take a drop in that family living withdrawal. And the reality is sometimes we don't recognize this revenue shortfall until later in the year, and much of the family living expenses would have already been drawn out. Along that same thought process, the bank still probably expects its interest to be paid and any term debt to be repaid in that year. So at this point, we've had obligations of $30 of earnings, but we only had 20 that we generated. And in that situation, instead of growing the business, we're going to shrink our equity by $10. Okay. So in this situation, we still managed our earnings, but we had to use up some of our equity in order to fund all parts of our business. So those were some simple examples. What I'd like to share with you now is a little more detailed, because I think it's important that you realize that what happens in any one year may or may not be the whole story. It'd be really good to look at these numbers on a 3, 4, 5-year situation. And so what we're looking here is an example of Floyd Farms and how they used their earnings for the past 4 years. So let's start off with 2017. They used 85% of their revenue went to cover operating expenses. Okay. That only left them $15 out of every 100 to use for family living, interest, and debt service. Okay. When you look at how that was allocated, 26% of earnings went to family living, 34% of earnings went to interest expense in that year, and 70% of their earnings were needed for term debt repayment. So they needed to use 130% of earnings in that year. So actually the business shrank by 30%. Okay. And again, that would be very scary. But as we look through 2018, 2019, 2020, you can see that on average for the last 4 years, that it hasn't been quite as bad as it was in 2017. On average, they spent 82 cents out of every dollar of revenue on operating expenses. That left them with earnings as a percent of revenue of 18%. So they have $18 out of every $100 available for family living, interest, and debt. You can see that in my last column here, I'm saying that my goal would be to have at least 30% there. So as we look at the average, about 26% of earnings went to support family living and income taxes. That was slightly above our goal of less than 25%. Interest expense used up 25% of our earnings, which was, right at the goal. It was at 25. And then we spent 44% on our term debt, which was much higher than our goal of spending less than 25%. If you look at that combination of interest expense and debt, they were using 69% of their earnings to service debt in 2017, 2020. And that is significantly higher than the 50% that we'd like to see as a maximum. So the business did grow, but instead of growing at, a 25% level, it only grew at a 5% level year over year. And that was highly variable. It was from a negative 30% to a high of 18%. So in none of those years were they able to grow the business, at our preferred rate of 25% of earnings going to growth. So as you look at that, you start thinking, well, what's the problem? What's going on here? Their family living is too high, their debt service is too high. And I would kind of flip that around a little bit. And I think we need to go back up here to this EBITDA supply number. I think that's the number that's too low. Okay? If they could have increased that EBITDA supply from 18% to 30%, then you would have seen that family living would have been well under 25%, and their interest and debt service number, instead of being 69% of earnings, would have only been 41%. And that would have resulted in your percentage available for asset growth being closer to 25%. So as I look at this operation, to me, one of the first things that we need to focus on is how can we do a better job of managing EBITDA supply? How can we do a better job of keeping more of our revenue to have it available for family living, interest, and debt service? So, of course, what I think they need is an EBITDA improvement plan, right? Let's talk about this ratio a little bit more. It's fairly easy to calculate. You take your earnings and divide it by your total revenue. Okay? Whenever that ratio comes in at 15% or less, we're going to consider that you're vulnerable, that the business is really vulnerable because the EBITDA efficiency is just too low. If it's in that 15 to 30% range, we consider it resilient. The business continues very well year after year. It can kind of stay in business, but it just doesn't have a whole lot of cushion in those years when things just don't go the way we planned them to. Okay, you're not building the cushion for future years when you're in that resilient level, and you can see that on average. The Floyd farm example has been in that resilient position all 4 years that we looked at, from 15 to 16, 20, 22%. If they could get that number over 30, they'd be considered agile, which means they've got a lot more flexibility, the ability to withstand uncertainty and risk a whole lot better. When they ran their projections for 2021, they were only projecting a EBITDA efficiency ratio of about 18%. As we've already seen, 18% is just not going to get it done for this operation. So let's talk about what we can do. What are some incremental steps that we could take to maybe help this operation improve its EBITDA efficiency? So look at this ratio down here at the bottom. In 2020, they had revenue of just over $2.7 million. Okay, that was 100% of their revenue. They spent on operating expenses $2.1 million, or roughly 78%. Okay? So their earnings came in at $612,000, or 22% EBITDA efficiency. Let's say that they set a goal in 2021 that they wanted that EBITDA efficiency to go up to 25%. So it's not a huge increase. It's only 3% higher than what they had in 2020.
Media volume set to 25%.
But it is, an improvement. So to do that, they need to have earnings of $692,000, and that would result in a 25% EBITDA efficiency ratio. So this operation needs to increase its earnings by $79,613. Okay? So what's that mean? How are we going to do that? Well, we come over here to the blue boxes and we start thinking about revenue strategies. Okay? What are some things that we can do to help increase our revenue or reduce our expenses? Okay? And we're probably not going to find just one thing that's going to solve this problem. It may be a bunch of $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 changes that do result in an EBITDA improvement in 2021. For a lot of people, it's just a return to normal production, if there is such a thing. I know for 2017 to 20, we've certainly had a lot of weather issues, a lot of challenges from a production standpoint. But, take a look at what the normal production would be and see how much of a difference that would make. A second thing to do is just to evaluate each different enterprise, evaluate the earnings that each enterprise can generate. And, take a look and see which crops are good generators of earnings and which ones are not so good. And start making plans to minimize the, amount of lower earnings crops and focus more on the ones that have high earning potential. On the expense side, just thinking about if we could cut our expenses 1% in 2021, that would account for $21,000 of earnings change. Okay, so start looking at your top 5 expenses and see are there ways that we can reduce those expenses by 1 or 2%. And the big thing is, as you make notes on this page, you're starting to write the plan that's going to help improve your earnings of your business. And as you write those things down, it's a little more accountable for you as you go through the year, as you pencil out what changes I need to make in the operation and how it's going to impact me. So that's one ratio that I think is really important. And as you improve EBITDA efficiency, that just provides more opportunity to create asset growth. The second ratio that I would always take a look at would be this working capital sufficiency ratio. And what working capital is, it's just the difference between your current assets and your current liabilities. And the simple definition of a current asset is it is an asset that can turn to cash within the next 12 months. Okay? So it's going to be things like your checking account balance, crop inventory, receivables, if they are collectible, government payment receivables, those types of things. Those are your current assets. Your current liabilities are those liabilities that you have to pay within the next 12 months. It's the current portion of term debt. It's any accounts payable or open accounts that you may have. It's taxes that are payable, things of that nature. It's the operating loan balance that you have, with your lender. Those would be your current assets. So the difference between those current assets and current liabilities is what's called working capital. And then I like to take that working capital and divide it by my operating expenses, because that gives me an idea of how much of my projected expenses can I fund from my own business. Okay. So in this case, we'd like to see a business, have 25% of working capital as a percent of their operating expenses. So if I had $1 million of operating expenses, I'd like to have $250,000 of working capital, because that should minimize the amount of money I had to borrow for operating purposes. It would help fund family living draws during the year and so forth. The problem with this operation is they don't have any working capital. You can see in 2017, it was a minus 5%. 2018, it was half of 1%. 2019, it was negative, and in 2020, it was negative. They are very vulnerable because they're having to borrow money from day one in order to pay any expenses as they move forward. So this working capital sufficiency for this operation is very scary. The 2021 projection does show it going up to about 4%, but still that leaves them in this vulnerable category of being less than 10% of your expected expenses. So similar to our EBITDA improvement plan, we need to come up with a working capital improvement plan. And so we're going to do a similar calculation. Our working capital at the end of 2020 was negative $8,000. We had operating expenses of $2.1 million. So we had a zero working capital operating expense ratio. In 2021, this farm set a goal of getting that to 15%, meaning they want to have $323,000 of working capital at the end of the year, and that would represent 15% of their 2021 operating expenses. To do that, they need to increase their working capital by $331,000. This is a little bigger elephant to eat than the earnings problem we have. We only had to come up with $79,000 of earnings change, but now we're looking at a way to come up with $331,000. And so how would we go about doing that? Well, the first thing is that if we do improve our EBITDA, our earnings by $79,000, like we were suggesting on the slide before, that should increase working capital by that same $79,000. So we've gotten a big chunk of our working capital solved. We still need to come up with another $250,000 of working capital improvement. And so some of the common ways we might look at doing that is, we can always evaluate our family living and income tax requirements, see if there's anything we can do there to minimize or reduce the family living draws. From a liability standpoint, a good way to improve this is to look through the capital assets of the business and liquidate any assets that aren't needed, and use those proceeds to help build our working capital. Another option that some people would consider is maybe doing a refi, that if they had some long-term equity, maybe we do some refinancing to, try to put some working capital back in the business and, try to give us a better liquidity position as we move forward. And that's certainly, an item that we'd want to consider, but, in the short run, you want to take a look at other ways that we could improve our working capital during 2021. But before we did a refi, one of the ratios that I would want to take a look at is what we call the core equity burn rate. And that's a long title for, a pretty basic concept here. So let's take a look at Floyd Farms and see what their core equity is and what kind of burn rate does the business have. So if you were to do a refi, most likely what you would want to refi again or refinance against would be something like real estate. That's the core equity that any business would have. And so Floyd Farms has real estate with a market value of $3.6 million. Okay? Their bank is usually willing to loan up to 60% of that value in term loans. Okay, they'd be willing to loan up to $2.16 million if the real estate was appraised at 3.6 and they loaned the full 60% loan to collateral value. So they have borrowing capacity of about $2.1 million. Currently, at the end of 2020, Floyd Farms had $750,000 of long-term liability. So they have what we call excess reserves of about $1.4 million that's available. If you go back and think that, hey, what if we had a wipeout year and we lost $200,000, that our earnings minus family living and our debt service was short $200,000. Okay. If I look at an excess reserve of 1.4 million and I had a loss of $200,000, I could do that basically 7 times. So the burn rate here is 7 years. Okay. So I hope that's making sense. It's not saying they will lose 200,000, but we're trying to do some what if scenario. How many bad years could this business survive? And so they would burn through $1.4 million in about 7 years. Okay? If you look at our ratio or our indicators here, you can see that if that number is less than 3 years, you would be very vulnerable. Okay? Because even though the bank says their loan's 60%, as you got down to a burn rate of 3 years or 2 years, they're going to be very leery of doing any kind of refinance. So we want to keep that core equity burn rate at least above 3 years, and hopefully it's over 7 years. When it's in that 3 to 7 year burn rate, well, that's considered resilient. And when it's over 7, you'd be considered agile. So we initially look at that and say 7 years, we're in an agile position. A refinance might be doable. But what if something came through? What if there was some kind of black swan again in 2021 and we saw real estate values drop 20%? Not predicting that. I'm not trying to scare anybody. I'm just trying to get you to think, well, what are the parameters that I'm dealing with within my business? And if the real estate were to drop 20%, the market value would drop down to under $3 million to about $2.9 million. That would cut their borrowing capacity to about $1.7 million, subtracting out what they already owe at the end of the year. They have excess reserves of $978,000. Now their burn rate drops from 7 years to about 5 years. Okay? And so again, this is part of the sensitivity that you want to do to have confidence in your financial numbers. And so you want to do some of these shock tests to see how well your business would fare, under different scenarios. If we look at that, dropping it down to 4.9 years would put us right in the middle of the resilient level. And that's still pretty solid when you think about taking a 20% hit in your real estate value and still being able to show resiliency in your core equity burn rate. So again, I think that's a positive. Maybe doing a refi isn't too bad. So let's see what happens if we do a refi. Let's just say we want to borrow $250,000. Okay, so that's what we need to finish out our working capital improvement if we get our earnings up by $79,000. And so if we were to do that, we would still have the same market value, same loan value, same borrowing capacity, but now we have long-term liabilities of $1 million, drops our excess reserves to $1.1 million. Our core equity burn rate drops to 5.8 years. So when it was 7, it drops us just under 6. We're in the high side of resiliency. So maybe the refi would still be workable. If we look at the 20% drop in real estate values, that would drop our core equity burn rate down to about 3.5 years. Still in the resilient level, but getting a lot closer to turning red. Okay. So again, this is one of the things that the business is looking at is they know they need to improve earnings. They recognize that they need to improve working capital. This is one method that they could improve working capital, but it comes at a risk. It reduces our core equity burn rate. And if we were to see any type of real estate drop in value, we could really be pushing to the vulnerable level of a core equity burn rate. And so I just want to kind of leave you with those 3 different ratios. That's not everything that you need to know, but I want you to understand that these ratios all work together, and having one good number doesn't necessarily mean your other ratios look good. And so if you want to learn more about risk management, how you deal with the people, production, market, financial, and legal risk that you're facing every day, if you want to learn more about Floyd and how to get some ducks, I would encourage you to consider signing up for one of the executive farm management programs that are coming up in January and February. The first thing we're going to do is in January, in fact, we're going to start next week. We've got 4 one-hour webinars from 9 o'clock starting on Tuesdays starting January 12th for the following 4 weeks. We're going to do 1-hour webinars that will help get you thinking about different parts of your business. The first webinar on the 12th will be by Greg Hopper, and it's transforming your business on the fly. I've heard Greg speak several times, and it will certainly be informative and challenging what he's going to talk about. But Greg reads a lot. He's always reading the latest literature on planning and management, and he's going to be talking about a dual transformation and some things that you might want to apply to your business as you move forward. The following week, I'll be leading the program on how do you manage cash for expiration, but talking about other ways than what we've covered here today on how to generate more cash to build working capital, and talking more in detail about how earnings and liability structure is very critical to building and maintaining working capital, as we move through the year. On January 26th, David Mayo from East Carolina is going to be talking about family succession issues and how do you lead the business through a transition and succession. That's not always something within the family, but it could be transitioning in succession in different positions within the business. But it'll be a good learning opportunity to think about how you build your management team for your operation in 2021 and going forward. And then finally, on February 2nd, Sharon Justice will be on. And it's good that there's only one simple adjustment, because when Sharon gets wound up, she is full of information and she can go and go and go. So it will be very informative to hear what the one change that you can make to make family conversations and sticky conversations more manageable. And I would guarantee that you will get something out of that conversation and that session with Sharon. So that's 4 hours of time over the next month, be a good opportunity to get some more education and some more ideas for managing the business moving forward. And then if you really want to dive in deeper, we're going to do a boot camp, which is kind of a scaled down version of our executive farm management program that we do years when we don't have COVID impacting us. The boot camp will be, several hours a day for 3 days from February 10th through the 12th. And you'll have an opportunity to learn more about the business model canvas and actually applying an actual case farm to some of these concepts. And we will be building on the topics that are covered in the webinar and have a lot more opportunity to ask questions, to interact, and to begin to get an idea of what EFM is all about, and also some of the management techniques that will help manage your business in 2021. All of these webinars and the boot camp will be offered via Zoom. It will be interactive, and we'd encourage you to sign up. Blake Brown is the director of the EFM program. I don't know if Blake, if you wanted to share any more about the Executive Farm Management Program that's coming up.
Sure, Scott. Thank you. We're really excited about our virtual program this year. We normally have about a 12-day program, but this year our boot camp is, as Scott mentioned, is going to be for 3 half days. It's still going to be really interactive. As Scott mentioned, we're going to be using a case study farm that will really look familiar to a lot of you. It's a very realistic case study. You'll be helping this family in the case study farm sort out some of the problems that Scott has talked about today. You'll be using some of the strategic planning tools that Greg Copper gives you, and some of the family succession issues. We'll deal with them for this case study farm, and then we'll also talk about some human resource issues and communicating that Sharon Justice will help us with. We have always had a very heavy emphasis on fresh produce farms. We've had some awesome participants from the Carolinas and Virginia and Georgia from the fresh produce industry and our full EFMs in the past 3 years. And we hope that we will have a good contingent of fresh produce farms in this virtual program. You'll find it's to be some very useful information. We've got a lot of support from national organizations. We've got a lot of support, especially from the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Association, and we very much appreciate their support and allowing us to be in the Southeast Fruit and Vegetable Conference here. Now, if you happen to be a peanut farmer, we have the National Peanut Board is actually providing tuition credits for this program. The virtual boot camp is $500 for the 3 half days. But if you happen to be a peanut farmer, the National Peanut Board has likes this program so much, they said they would contribute $150, so you'll only have to pay $350. But I can assure you it's well worth it. Go to the web address that Scott shared. It's go.ncsu.edu/EFM, or just Google Executive Farm Management Program and you'll come up with our webpage. And if you have any questions, you'll be able to email me or call my assistant, Margaret Huffman, and hopefully we'll get you signed up and we'll get you cranking on some of this exciting business management stuff. Scott, do you have anything else?
No, thank you, Blake. I just would encourage you, to look at these ratios, and hopefully this will help you have some more confidence in the way you manage the finances on your business. And with that confidence, hopefully it will help you manage the controllables and manage around those things that are uncontrollable. So with that, I would open it up to any questions. If anybody has some questions, I'll be glad to answer those to the extent I can. So,
absolutely. Thank you, Scott. And just remember, for our audience, you can type your questions into the question box, press send, and we will take questions if you have any. I don't see any right now, but we'll just take another minute or so to see if anybody has any questions they want to submit. One of the things about our EFM is just people love the interactive nature about it. I'll just throw that out there. They love getting to know the other farmers. And even though it's virtual this year, you're going to meet farmers from all over the Southeast if you participate in some of these seminars. And just those connections are worth so much, so many times. I see a question that's popped up, Scott. It says, do you have a recommendation for farmers needing assistance with taxes, doing the taxes? What, Catherine's?
A recommendation in terms of accountant that they...
Yeah, Catherine, do you mean what accountants might be helpful? You know, I think what we can do is, Scott, could we provide your email? And if Catherine needs some more personal information on that, we could give that to her.
Let me switch. So here's my email address is smickey@clemson.edu. You know, if you have those types of questions, you know, be glad to try to answer those things. You know, when you're looking for a tax accountant, you know, I think the one thing you want is, well, a couple of things that would be important to me is, one, does the practitioner do other farm returns? You know, because there's a special schedule for farm tax returns, and you know, you want somebody who's familiar with those forms and those schedules, and that spends some time doing research on how to best manage the taxes. Second thing, I would want one who's looking at it, my tax situation over a period of time, rather than just trying to get today's taxes as low as possible. The goal for me would always be to pay the least amount of taxes over a 5-year period, not necessarily in any 1 year. So don't, you wouldn't want a tax preparer who's just focusing on minimizing taxes this year, but is looking at where you're going to take your business as you move forward. I think one of the important things to remember is that ideally your business is going to be profitable. And if your business is profitable, you will have some income tax obligations. We just want to minimize how much that is. So those are a couple of things to think about when you're looking for a tax practitioner.
Well, Scott, I don't see any other questions at the moment, but you have, our audience has your information, your email address and everything there. I hope they'll consider signing up for some of our EFM or Executive Farm Management webinars or the boot camp. And so, Scott, thank you again for your time and expertise. Thank you to our audience for attending the presentation. Just remember that all these educational presentations will be available to you until April 30th. In other words, you're going to be able to log in here and see these presentations all the way up till April 30th. You can come back to a presentation and rewatch it if you want to, or if you need a service or a product provider in the virtual trade show, you'll be able to go there after this and still connect with them. So again, thank you everyone for your participation, and at this time we'll conclude the presentation.